In the far reaches of the galaxy, the Ishari Galactic Empire ruled with unmatched power. A towering species, known for their immense size and advanced technology, the Ishari were relentless in their quest for expansion, their multi-armed warriors feared by all. Across the stars, that empire stretched farther than any other, swallowing planets and civilizations without mercy. For centuries, the Ishari had encountered countless species, each one weaker than the last, and each time, their approach was the same: conquer, dominate, and destroy. The Ishari had never met a species that could pose a serious threat, and they were confident this would remain true forever. But as they received reports of a new race on the edge of their known space, their commanders brushed it off as just another primitive species to be quickly neutralized. The planet Darien 6 was just another unremarkable world that had caught the interest of the human race. A young species compared to the Ishari, humans had begun to spread across the galaxy, slowly colonizing worlds that they had begun to adapt to with astonishing speed. They were not as advanced as the Ishari, but what they lacked in technology, they made up for with determination, resilience, and a drive to survive that no one had expected. When the Ishari dispatched a fleet to investigate, they believed they were simply dealing with another weak race, one that would be easily crushed. But what they found when they arrived on Darien 6 shook them to their core. A fleet of human ships, far more advanced than the Ishari had anticipated, stood ready for battle. These humans, led by Captain Alex Rowan, had adapted to their hostile environment in ways the Ishari could never have imagined. They had developed new technologies that used elements of the Ishari technology in ways that made no sense to the invading aliens. Their ships, though smaller, were equipped with weapons that the Ishari had not seen before. To the Ishari, this was an unexpected anomaly. They had no idea what they were about to face. The first contact was not at all like the Ishari had expected. As the human ships appeared on their sensors, the Ishari were ready to strike. But what they encountered was not the crumbling defense of a primitive species. Instead, the humans' fleet, with Captain Rowan at the helm, prepared to engage with a cold precision that stunned the Ishari diplomats. The first communication came through, transmitted by Rowan's calm voice. "We're not afraid of you." The Ishari leaders on their command ships were confused. They had expected fear, desperation, perhaps even submission. What they received instead was a challenge, one that they were not prepared for. The humans didn't back down. The human ships, powered by new technologies and ingenuity, fired first, catching the Ishari by surprise. Their weapons, once thought to be crude and ineffective, sent shockwaves through the Ishari fleet. The humans weren't just defending their colony, they were striking back with a fury that no one could have predicted. And with each hit, the humans' message became clearer. Captain Rowan's voice rang out again, this time across the vastness of space, to all Ishari ships within range. "Run." The Ishari did not understand. This was not how it was supposed to go. They were the conquerors, the dominant species of the galaxy. And yet, now they were faced with an opponent who didn't cower or surrender, who didn't fold under pressure. The humans fought back with such intensity that the Ishari fleet was forced to retreat. Captain Rowan's words echoed across the void, a warning that carried more weight than anything the Ishari had ever encountered. As the Ishari ships retreated from the planet, their commanders were left to contemplate the impossible. They had never been challenged in this way before. A single human fleet, led by a single captain, had stood in their way and forced them to flee. The Ishari had never fought a species like this. They had never encountered a race with this much grit, this much heart, or this much defiance. And what terrified them most was not that the humans had fought back, but that they had done so with an intensity that had shattered everything the Ishari believed about power. This wasn't just a warning, it was a declaration. The Empire had never fought humans before. Now they had learned the hard way. Run. The message was clear. The humans were not to be underestimated, and as the retreating Ishari fleet vanished into the distance, a chilling thought began to spread among their ranks. Perhaps the true battle had just begun. The news of the humans' unexpected resistance spread like wildfire through the HFY Empire. The Empire, known for its vast intelligence network, had always prided itself on its ability to quickly adapt to new threats, but nothing had prepared them for what they encountered on Darien 6. Imperial analysts pored over every bit of footage they could gather from the human conflict, trying to make sense of how a relatively young, unpolished species could cause so much disruption. At first, it seemed like a fluke. The humans were using technology that didn't make sense, blending their own crude inventions with HFY technology in ways that baffled the analysts. The human tactics were even more puzzling, chaotic, unpredictable, almost like they didn't have a strategy at all, and yet they were working. The more the analysts studied, the more it became clear. The humans were not simply fighting, they were surviving. In the heart of the Empire's war rooms, General Kor, the fiercest tactician in the HFY military, was tasked with the responsibility of studying the humans in depth. With years of experience in crushing rebellions and defeating countless species, Kor had built his reputation on his ability to analyze and destroy any enemy that stood before him. He had never encountered a threat that he couldn't eliminate, and he certainly didn't believe the humans would be any different. At first, he viewed them with nothing more than disdain, a nuisance, something that would be easily swept aside once the true power of the Empire was brought to bear. But as Kor watched more footage of human soldiers and civilians standing their ground against the HFY, his confidence began to waver. What disturbed Kor most was not the humans' technology or their methods, but the sheer determination they displayed. These humans were not simply fighting, they were evolving. With each battle, they adapted, turning their weaknesses into strengths. Their technology, though inferior to that of the HFY, was being used in ways that made it far more effective than anyone could have predicted. Kor couldn't help but feel a growing sense of unease as he watched the humans' relentless struggle. Every time he thought he understood their methods, they would surprise him again. They didn't follow any known patterns. They didn't care about conventional tactics. The humans were willing to sacrifice anything in their path to survive, and that was something the HFY had never had to deal with. In one battle, a human ship, outnumbered and outgunned, had taken a direct hit to its core systems. Yet, instead of retreating, the human crew had managed to repair their ship in the middle of the battle and fight back with renewed intensity. It was a tactic Kor had never seen before. The ship, crippled but defiant, had lured the HFY into a trap, using the wreckage as cover to ambush the larger force. The human ship didn't just survive, it turned the tables on its attackers. The HFY fleet had been forced to retreat, humiliated by a single ship's determination to keep fighting. As Kor watched more footage, his doubts grew. The humans' resilience was unlike anything he had encountered. Every time he thought he had them figured out, they would find a new way to outwit him. It was as if they were constantly learning, constantly evolving in ways that defied logic. The humans' ability to adapt was frightening. And it wasn't just their military that was formidable, it was their society. The humans, despite their differences, seemed to pull together when faced with a common enemy. Their unity was a force to be reckoned with. What bothered Kor the most, though, was the humans' refusal to break. In every engagement, even when faced with overwhelming force, the humans never gave up. They didn't fight like any species Kor had ever faced before. It wasn't about victory for them, it was about survival. And that was something the HFY Empire had never fully understood. The idea that a species could fight not for conquest, but simply to preserve their way of life, was foreign to the HFY mindset. The more Kor studied the humans, the more he realized that their strength didn't come from their weapons or their technology. It came from their will to survive. Kor's arrogance, built over decades of conquest, began to crack. The humans were not just a passing nuisance, they were a force that could not be ignored. And as he prepared to launch the next phase of the Empire's campaign, Kor couldn't shake the unsettling feeling that the humans weren't just fighting to win, they were fighting to make sure the Empire never had a chance to rule them. The more he thought about it, the more he feared that the Ashari might not be the predators they believed themselves to be. For the first time in his career, General Kor began to question whether the Empire's dominance could truly withstand this new, unpredictable threat. The humans had proven one thing without a doubt: they would not be easily defeated. The Ashari Empire, unwilling to accept any challenge to its supremacy, unleashed its full might against the humans. A massive fleet, more advanced and far more powerful than anything the humans could muster, arrived above Darien 6. General Kor, determined to put an end to the defiance shown by Captain Rowan and his people, commanded the fleet to crush the human resistance. He had no doubts that the humans would either surrender or be obliterated within hours. It was meant to be a swift and brutal victory, the type the Ashari had known for centuries. However, as soon as the battle began, something strange happened. Instead of the humans retreating or crumbling before the overwhelming might of the Empire, they fought back with an intensity that caught the Ashari completely off guard. The humans didn't wait for the Empire to come to them. They took the fight straight to the invaders, using every resource at their disposal. In the dense forests and rugged landscapes of Darien 6, they set traps, attacked from unexpected angles, and blended seamlessly into their surroundings. Guerrilla tactics, unfamiliar and foreign to the Ashari, disrupted the Empire's carefully crafted plans. The humans turned the planet into a battlefield, using every rock, tree, and piece of debris as a shield or a weapon. What was even more alarming was that the humans didn't just fight back, they adapted. As the battle raged on, the human forces began to reverse engineer the Ashari's technology. In the heat of battle, a group of human engineers managed to hijack one of the downed Ashari ships, turning its own weapons against the attacking fleet. This was not a simple act of desperation. It was a calculated, intelligent move that showed the humans' true potential. They didn't rely on brute force alone. Instead, they used the knowledge they gained from their enemies to fight back in ways that no one could have predicted. The Ashari warships, once thought invincible, were now being torn apart by their own technology, and the humans were only getting bolder with every passing moment. Kor, watching from the command center aboard his flagship, felt his confidence slip away. This wasn't supposed to happen. He had believed that the humans were no more than a nuisance, something that would fall easily before the might of the Ashari military. Now the tide was turning. His fleet, once so certain of victory, was being forced into a defensive position. The humans, with their ingenuity and resourcefulness, were proving to be far more than the Empire had ever anticipated. The battle became a chaotic mess. The Ashari ships, despite their superior technology, struggled to keep up with the humans' unpredictable tactics. Time and again, human forces managed to strike where they were least expected, hitting key targets with precision. A pair of human fighter pilots, outnumbered and outgunned, managed to disable a pair of Ashari cruisers using hit-and-run tactics that seemed almost reckless at first, but turned out to be devastatingly effective. One Ashari battleship, caught off guard by a human trap, had its engines crippled by a group of human commandos who infiltrated the ship and sabotaged its systems from the inside. This shouldn't be happening, Kor muttered to himself, his frustration mounting with every lost ship and every setback. The humans' survival instinct was unlike anything he had ever seen. They didn't just fight, they fought with a desperate, raw energy, using whatever they could to hold their ground. And with each passing minute, it became more and more apparent that these humans weren't just fighting to defend their planet. They were fighting to survive, to preserve their existence at any cost. This fierce independence, this refusal to bow down, was what set them apart from every other species the Ashari had encountered. The humans' unpredictable nature became their greatest weapon. No matter how hard the Empire pushed, no matter how much firepower was brought to bear, the humans kept coming. They were like an unstoppable force, forcing the Ashari to rethink everything they knew about warfare. Kor, his face tightening in frustration, realized that the humans had thrown the Ashari into chaos. The Empire's carefully calculated strategy was falling apart. They hadn't just underestimated the humans, they had misunderstood them entirely. What they had mistaken for weakness was actually the core of humanity's strength, their ability to survive, to adapt, and to never give up. As the battle on Darien 6 continued, it became clear that this would not be a quick victory for the Ashari. They were no longer fighting a simple colony. They were fighting a race that had learned the true meaning of resilience. And as Kor stared at the battle unfolding before him, one thought gnawed at him, more troubling than anything else. What if the humans were just getting started? As the war dragged on, the humans began to reveal a strategy that the Ashari Empire was completely unprepared for. The humans knew they could never hope to match the Empire's sheer firepower or the vastness of its fleet. So, rather than facing the Ashari head-on in open battle, Captain Rowan and his commanders decided to engage in a different kind of war, a war of attrition. They didn't attack the Empire's strongest forces. Instead, they focused on its weakest points, the supply lines, the infrastructure that the mighty Empire depended on to maintain its far-reaching campaigns. They struck when and where the Ashari least expected it, sabotaging supply depots, disabling communication relays, and attacking the transport ships that carried vital resources between worlds. It wasn't glamorous, and it wasn't heroic in the traditional sense, but it was effective. One by one, the Empire's logistical systems began to falter under the relentless pressure from the humans. The Ashari, accustomed to overwhelming force and total control, couldn't fathom this new kind of warfare. The humans weren't interested in a direct fight for dominance. Instead, they used the vast and varied terrains of the galaxy to their advantage, slipping in and out of hostile space, attacking from the shadows, and disappearing just as quickly. The Ashari's enormous fleet, stretched thin across countless worlds, found itself unable to respond swiftly enough to the unpredictable nature of the human attacks. The more the humans fought, the more they learned. They began to understand the weaknesses in the Ashari's military strategies, patterns in their movements, gaps in their security, flaws in their technology. Every skirmish, no matter how small, taught them something new. And with each piece of knowledge they gained, the humans' ability to survive and strike at the heart of the Empire's might grew stronger. Captain Rowan, whose name had become synonymous with defiance, became more than just a leader. He became a symbol. A symbol of everything the Empire thought they could crush, but couldn't. His voice, calm yet unwavering, echoed through the comm channels of the Empire, a constant reminder of the humans' refusal to bend to the Empire's will. Run. It was the same message he had given after the first battle, and it had resonated far beyond its original context. To the Ashari, it was a warning, a taunt, and a challenge all at once. It spoke not just of military resistance, but of something deeper, the spirit of a species unwilling to bow down. And though the Ashari fought with all their might, every time they heard Rowan's voice, that warning echoed in their minds: run. But the Empire was proud. They refused to acknowledge that a race they considered beneath them could stand up to their might. And so, despite the mounting losses, the Ashari High Command pressed on. Yet, among the leaders of the Empire, there were growing whispers of doubt. A faction within the High Command, more pragmatic than the rest, began to question whether continuing this war was wise. They had underestimated humanity, and now the Ashari were paying the price. These Ashari leaders began to wonder whether it was possible to defeat an enemy that refused to follow the rules of engagement. The humans didn't play by the Empire's code. They fought with creativity, resourcefulness, and an unrelenting drive to survive, adapting to every challenge with startling speed. This wasn't the type of war the Ashari had ever fought, and it was starting to feel as if the humans weren't just surviving, they were thriving in the chaos. The question that loomed over the Ashari Empire's leadership was simple: how do you fight an enemy that refuses to be defeated? Kor, still leading the charge, clung to his belief that victory was still possible, but even he couldn't ignore the shifting winds of war. The humans weren't just making their presence known, they were breaking the very rules the Ashari had built their empire on. They were teaching the Empire, in the most painful way possible, that might alone could not guarantee victory. And as the war continued, the human strategy began to have an undeniable impact. The Empire was growing weaker. Each raid, each surprise attack, drained more of their resources and undermined their control. It was clear now. Humanity wasn't just an annoyance anymore. They were a real threat, and the Ashari had no idea how to stop them. The tension within the Empire's ranks continued to build. The more the humans learned, the more dangerous they became. The Empire's leaders, once so certain of their dominance, now faced the terrifying possibility that they might not be able to defeat the humans at all. As the humans' war of attrition stretched on, the Empire's confidence was slowly replaced with uncertainty. And in the midst of it all, Captain Rowan's voice continued to haunt them, his warning now louder than ever: run. The war between humanity and the Ashari Empire reached a boiling point. Determined to crush the humans once and for all, the Empire launched a full-scale offensive, bringing their most formidable warships and ground forces to bear. The Ashari's fleet, a terrifying sight to anyone in its path, was armed with the most advanced technology in the galaxy. Their troops, armored and relentless, were bred for domination. The humans, by contrast, had always been outnumbered, their technology inferior, their forces smaller. But the Ashari had underestimated them. As the massive assault began, the humans revealed just how far they had come since their first encounter with the Empire. Instead of crumbling under the pressure, the humans fought back with a surprising level of coordination and ingenuity. Every strike they made, every battle they fought, seemed more calculated and precise than the last. Their tactics, once thought chaotic and unpredictable, were now proving to be a dangerous strength. The humans' ability to outsmart their much larger and more technologically superior foes was becoming evident. They didn't rely on brute force or numbers. They used every advantage they could find: terrain, technology, and most importantly, their own creativity, to disrupt the Empire's carefully laid plans. The Ashari were beginning to realize that defeating humanity would not be as simple as they had hoped. The tipping point came when Captain Alex Rowan led a daring assault on an Ashari command ship, a massive and heavily protected vessel that had been coordinating the Empire's attacks. For weeks, the humans had been observing the Ashari's tactics, studying their weaknesses, and gathering every piece of intelligence they could. Rowan and his team identified a small but crucial flaw in the command ship's shielding system, a vulnerability that the Ashari had overlooked in their arrogance. It was a small opening, but in warfare, it was often the smallest cracks that led to the greatest collapse. Under the cover of darkness and deception, Captain Rowan and his crew launched their attack. They infiltrated the command ship, using their knowledge of Ashari technology and their own guerrilla tactics to penetrate deep into the vessel. What followed was a series of quick, calculated strikes that crippled the ship's defensive systems. The humans didn't just disable the command ship, they took control of it. With one well-timed strike, they rendered the Ashari's primary battle fleet vulnerable, leaving them without coordination and direction. The loss was devastating. The Empire's pride and strength, the vessel that controlled their war effort, was now in the hands of the humans. The damage to the Ashari war machine was irreparable, and the message that rang out across the galaxy was clear: humanity was no longer a species to be ignored or underestimated. They had struck at the heart of the Empire and survived. The once mighty Ashari Empire, which had believed itself untouchable, had suffered a humiliating defeat. The ramifications were immediate. In the high chambers of the Ashari command, a deep unease began to spread. Some factions of the Empire's leadership, seeing the catastrophic loss, began to question the wisdom of continuing the war. They feared that the humans had proven their ability to defeat even the Empire's most formidable forces. If humanity could breach the heart of the Empire, how much longer could they hold the Empire together? The voices of caution grew louder. Some suggested pulling back, perhaps even negotiating a ceasefire or retreating to preserve the Empire's power. But the faction led by General Kor, the unyielding warlord who had driven the Empire's conquest, was resolute. Retreat was not an option. To do so would show weakness, and the Ashari could never afford to appear weak, especially now that their control of the galaxy was being threatened. Kor's stance was firm. If the Empire pulled back now, it would lose not only the war, but its grip on the galaxy. The Ashari Empire's very foundation was built on dominance and fear. A retreat would signify that the Empire could be defeated, that the humans were a threat that could not be ignored. And if that idea spread, the entire galaxy would see the Ashari as vulnerable. Kor refused to let that happen. His pride would not allow it. As the Empire's leadership grappled with what to do next, the humans, led by Rowan, prepared for what would come. The war had reached a crucial juncture, and both sides knew that the next phase of the conflict would decide the fate of the galaxy. Humanity had made its mark, and now the Ashari faced the uncomfortable reality that their empire, so long unchallenged, was at risk of crumbling under the weight of their own arrogance. The tipping point had been reached, and there was no turning back. As the war dragged on, the once unified Ashari Empire began to show cracks. The relentless human resistance, fueled by their unwavering will to survive, had forced the Empire to question everything. What had started as a seemingly simple conquest was now a prolonged conflict that had drained the Empire's resources and morale. The humans, with their ability to adapt, outthink, and survive, had proven themselves to be far more than the Empire had bargained for. Now, a new question echoed through the corridors of power. Was humanity truly a threat, or had the Ashari made a grave mistake in launching this war in the first place? In the high chambers of Ashari command, the leadership found themselves divided. On one side stood those who believed the war must continue at all costs. They argued that humanity's defiance could not be allowed to go unpunished. The humans had already struck deep into the heart of the Empire. Their presence could not be tolerated, for if they were allowed to grow, they might challenge the very foundation of Ashari rule. The fear of what humanity might become, a species that could stand up to the Ashari Empire and survive, was enough to fuel the Warhawks' resolve. Their voices echoed with fury, calling for the extermination of humanity, to wipe the scourge from the galaxy before it could spread further. But not all within the Ashari command agreed. Among the dissenters was Commander Vera, a seasoned strategist who had fought many battles for the Empire. Vera, unlike her counterparts, had begun to question the very premise of the war. She had seen the humans in action, how they fought not just with brute force but with innovation, resilience, and an uncanny ability to adapt to every situation. She had studied their tactics and seen the underlying message in their actions. The humans weren't just fighting for territory or power, they were fighting to survive. Their now famous warning, "Run," echoed in her mind. At first, she had thought it was a taunt, a challenge to their might. But over time, the more she observed, the more she began to wonder if it wasn't a threat at all. Perhaps it was a desperate call for survival, a plea to be left alone, to be allowed to exist without the crushing hand of the Empire bearing down on them. Vira's proposal was simple yet radical. She argued that the Empire should seek peace, not destruction. Instead of continuing a war that was draining the Empire's resources and shaking its power, the Ashari could consider an alliance, or at the very least, a ceasefire. She suggested that humanity's strength lay not in its ability to wage war, but in its will to survive against impossible odds. If the Empire could acknowledge humanity's right to exist, to find its place in the galaxy, it might avoid a conflict that could ultimately destroy both sides. But Vira's voice was drowned out by the overwhelming tide of those who refused to see reason. At the heart of it all stood General Kor, the Empire's most ruthless leader. He had seen the humans' resilience firsthand, and it filled him with a mixture of admiration and disdain. In his mind, their ability to survive was a sign of their strength, but it was also a direct challenge to the Ashari's dominance. Kor's pride, his belief in the unshakable power of the Empire, would not allow him to entertain the thought of backing down. The Empire had never known defeat, and he was determined to ensure it stayed that way. He prepared for what he believed would be the final confrontation, an all-out assault, a battle that would leave no room for doubt. This would be the moment the Ishari finally crushed humanity's will to resist, once and for all. But even as Kor rallied his forces for the impending battle, the seeds of doubt began to grow. Vira's words lingered in the air. Could the Empire continue to wage this war without destroying itself in the process? Would their pride ultimately lead to their downfall? The conflict within the Ishari leadership grew more intense with each passing day. The war that was meant to be a swift victory was now a quagmire, and even the might of the Empire was beginning to feel the strain. The question was no longer just whether humanity could be defeated, it was whether the Empire could survive its own pride. The Ishari command was torn. Some saw retreat as an admission of weakness, while others saw it as the only way to preserve the Empire. Kor, undeterred, still believed in the strength of his forces, but with every day that passed, the reality of their situation became harder to ignore. Humanity, with its unpredictable tactics and fierce survival instinct, had changed the rules of war. And as Kor looked ahead to the coming battle, he wondered, would the Ishari adapt, or would they be consumed by their own arrogance? The war that had once seemed like a brief conquest for the Ishari Empire now reached its tragic and defining climax. After years of intense fighting, the Empire, unable to bend humanity to its will, made one final desperate attempt to extinguish the human resistance for good. They turned their focus to Earth itself, the home world of the humans, believing that if they could destroy the heart of humanity's strength, the rest of the galaxy would fall in line. It was to be the Empire's last strike, a devastating assault meant to break humanity once and for all. But Captain Alex Rowan had seen this coming. Long before the Ishari set their sights on Earth, Rowan had prepared for this moment. He knew that the Empire's pride would eventually lead them to this point, where they would think that victory lay in wiping out the human homeworld. He had planned every detail, building alliances with races that had once been subjugated by the Empire, civilizations that had watched the Isharis rise with fear, but now stood ready to join humanity in a united front. These allies, each with their own advanced technologies and unique abilities, would tip the balance in humanity's favor. As the Ishari fleet descended upon Earth, they were met not by the broken, exhausted humans they had expected, but by a coalition of forces united under humanity's banner. The battle erupted in space and on the ground, a colossal clash that shook the very foundation of the galaxy. The Ishari, unprepared for such a unified resistance, found themselves caught in a deadly struggle. Their warships, though powerful, were unable to withstand the combined might of humanity and its allies. The human forces, armed with their creativity and resourcefulness, fought with a ferocity that even the Ishari had not anticipated. On the ground, the Empire's elite soldiers were pushed back by the humans' guerrilla tactics and their unwillingness to surrender. Every inch of Earth became a battlefield, from the cities to the wilderness, and every moment was a test of willpower. The humans fought not just to protect their home, but to prove that they were no longer a weak, fledgling species. They were a galactic power in their own right. As the battle raged, the Ishari forces began to buckle under the pressure. Their fleet, once invincible, was slowly pushed back, with each Ishari ship falling one by one as human tactics overwhelmed their superior technology. On the ground, the Ishari's once proud soldiers were driven from their positions. The humans had learned to fight in ways that the Empire had never predicted, using surprise, strategy, and sheer determination to exploit the Empire's vulnerabilities. It was clear now, the humans were no longer a species to be feared in passing. They were a force that could take on the greatest empire the galaxy had ever known. When the final blow came, it was not delivered by superior firepower or devastating weapons, but by the humans' unwavering spirit. The Ishari command, realizing that victory was slipping away, attempted to regroup, but it was too late. The tide had turned. The final remnants of their forces were scattered and defeated. The humans had won. The Ishari Empire, once proud and invincible, was forced to face the undeniable truth: they could not conquer humanity. They had underestimated the power of a species that fought not just with technology, but with an unyielding will to survive. In the aftermath of the battle, the galaxy stood in awe as humanity's message spread across the stars. They had fought back against the might of the Ishari, and now they were more than survivors. They were victors. Captain Rowan's voice, steady and resolute, rang out across the universe, reaching every corner of space. His message, a simple yet profound declaration, was broadcast to the Ishari and all who might hear it. Run, because next time you won't be so lucky. The words were a warning, but they also carried a promise. Humanity had learned from their struggle. They had adapted, grown stronger, and now they would no longer allow anyone to threaten their existence. The Ishari Empire had fallen, but humanity's rise was just beginning. The universe would never be the same again. The old order was gone, and in its place stood a new reality, one in which humanity had proven that sometimes the greatest weapon of all was not superior technology, but the sheer will to survive and fight for a future. The galaxy would now have to reckon with the human spirit, a force that could not be easily crushed, and a species that had earned its place among the stars.